Life Audio.
The Bible Study Podcast, episode 885. Today, the Bible Study Podcast is going someplace different, and we're going in between the Old Testament and the New Testament as we study the Intertestamental Period. Welcome to the Bible Study Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. We're going to look at that time period after the Old Testament ends and before the New Testament begins. And there's over 300 years in that gap between the two, and we'll talk about why that is. And we're going to look at this time period through the book of 1 Maccabees. But first, a word from this sponsor. So 1 Maccabees may or may not be in your Bible, and let's talk about why that is first of all. First Maccabees is a book that was written later on after the Old Testament canon was made by the Jewish elders. So the Jewish elders got together and they decided which of all the many books out there were canonical, were part of the Jewish scriptures. And First Maccabees came after that point, and some of the books after that point were not included, or it came after the deadline is more accurate, in the sense that some newer books were not included just because they were too new. And First Maccabees was one of those books. Second Maccabees was also one of those books. And there are also a third and fourth Maccabees, but you will have a harder time finding those, as those were not included because they're not considered authoritative. So that's different. Some are not included because they're not new, and some are not included because they're not authoritative. They're not thought to be accurate. And what happens is then in the Christian church, there are three main branches in the Christian church, as you are probably aware: the Roman Catholic branch, the Orthodox branch with all the separate branches for the Russian Orthodox or the Greek Orthodox or those under that branch. And the third major branch of the Christian church is the Protestant branch and all the different major branches there. In a Roman Catholic or an Orthodox Bible, you will find this book, First Maccabees. In a Protestant Bible, you won't, or you will find it in a separate section called Apocrypha. And that was, for instance, when Martin Luther translated the Bible into German from Latin. And in the Latin Vulgate Bible, you would find the book of First Maccabees, as well as other books that you would find in the Apocrypha section of Luther's Bible. And those Apocrypha is hidden. And it just basically was put in that section because it was not part of the Old Testament canon by the Jewish elders. And so the Jewish elders had said, these books form our scriptures. For us, that would be the Old Testament. And they excluded this book in the case of First Maccabees because it was too new. But when the Bible was translated from the original Hebrew of the Old Testament into Greek, the Septuagint, named because it was translated by 70 scholars into Greek, these books were included. So they were not going to be part of the Old Testament canon, but they were included in this Greek version, and the Greek version became what was the Bible of the church for the first 1,500 years or so. So the Bible of the Roman Catholic Church and the Bible of the Orthodox Church. But then the Protestant reformers, when they're looking at this, they're saying, well, let's just keep these separate. Martin Luther, for instance, did translate this book into German because he felt that it was useful to know this information, but did not include it in the normal part of the Bible, included it in a separate section. And over time, most Protestant Bibles have just dropped that section as being part of the Catholic Bible. But there is value in understanding what happens in First Maccabees. So in First Maccabees, we're going to find the story of Hanukkah. And so if you ever wondered where that was in your Bible and you didn't find it, it's because it's here. It happens in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And also, if you look at the history of the Old Testament and you look at world history through an Old Testament lens, you would see that the rise of many major civilizations are chronicled in the Old Testament. So the first major civilization mentioned in the Old Testament would be Egypt, obviously, and the Egypt captivity is one of the places you would find that. But throughout the book then after that, you would see Egypt as a major player in world politics at the time. And then you would see the rise of Assyria and Babylon roughly around the same time. And so before the Babylonian captivity happens, the northern kingdoms, the 10 kingdoms of Israel, are taken away into captivity by the Assyrians. So Assyrians are one of the major powers at that time. But before we leave the Old Testament, both of those are conquered by the new rival, the new civilization on the block, and that's the Persians. And so when the Bible ends in the Old Testament, the major player, the major civilization in the world, in the area where we are, in the Middle East, is Persia. And Persia rules basically from the Mediterranean Sea all the way over to India. Not in India, but all the way to the gates of India. So very large empire. But by the time we start the New Testament, it is gone. There is no Persia anymore. And all that happens in between, all that happens in the first few chapters of First Maccabees. So let's start with First Maccabees. We're not going to get very far today because we're going to do a lot of this setup information. But the first 8 verses in First Maccabees happen roughly around the years 336 to 323 BC. First Maccabees chapter 1, Alexander the Great. After Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and slaughtered the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. When the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army and ruled over countries, nations, and princes, and they paid him tribute. After this he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. So he summoned his most honored officers, who had been brought up with him from youth, and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. And after Alexander had reigned 12 years, he died. Then his officers began to rule, each in his own place. They all put on crowns after his death, and so did their descendants after them for many years, and they caused many evils on the earth. But that beginning part described how Alexander comes on the scene. His father, Philip of Macedon, had already united all of Greece, and the other thing that had happened intertestamental was the invasion of Greece by Persia, and that actually happens around the same time as the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and some of the rulers of Persia that are mentioned there are closely associated with the people who invaded Greece the first time. And when Philip of Macedon unites the people of Macedonia, where he was king, as the people of Greece, he decides to invade Persia, and his son is the one who does that because he dies. So Alexander, we call him Alexander the Great because he beat all of the kind of Greek known world there. He beats the Persians and campaigns all the way to India. But he is not king for very long. He is only a ruler for 12 years. He dies young, and his kingdom splits into a few different parts. So one is the Ptolemaic kingdom, and that is Egypt. So Egypt is ruled by the Ptolemies. That's Ptolemy. And the most famous Ptolemy would be later on Cleopatra. So Cleopatra, who is queen of Egypt, is not Egyptian. She is Macedonian. And so she is the 7th Cleopatra, and there are a bunch of Ptolemies. And so they will rule that area into the time of the New Testament. And then there's the Seleucid Empire, and that is kind of the Asian part of what was Persia. And you could see how that and Egypt are awful close to what is Israel, and so whether Israel is in one or the other kind of moves back and forth, but those are the two that are going to be most pertinent to our story as we look at what happens in Israel during this time period. There is also then a kingdom up here in what was Macedon and Greece, and then there's also a kingdom of Pergamum in which was Turkey, and then for a time period there was a separate kingdom up in Turkey and into Bulgaria and parts of Greece as well, but that didn't last that long. So the two that we're going to be talking about mostly are Egypt and the Seleucid Empire, and especially in the first part of the book, the Seleucid Empire, because that is going to trigger a lot of big changes in Israel, including the rise of two groups of people that we'll see in the New Testament. Both the Pharisees and the Sadducees will come out of this time period, and some of the conflicts that will come when these Greek Macedonian people are trying to rule this land of Israel or Judah. And we'll continue that story as we continue First Maccabees next week. And with that, we're going to end this episode of the Bible Study Podcast. If you have any questions, send an email to host@thebiblestudypodcast.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at thebiblestudypodcast.com. And thanks so much for listening. I want to take just a second to thank the team at Life Audio for their partnership with us on this podcast. If you go to lifeaudio.com, you'll find dozens of other faith-centered podcasts in their network. They've got shows about prayer, Bible study, parenting, and more.
I'm Billy Yancey, entrepreneur, fitness cowboy, father, retired Navy cornerback, and now podcast host. Listen to my new show, Billy and the Goat, on Life Audio. Happy listening.